The day it happened, I wasn't expecting anything. Marcus had left his notes at school, the whole folder, sitting on the desk like he'd just walked away mid-thought, and since I lived close enough, I told him I'd drop them off. That was it. That was the entire reason I was walking up to his front door that afternoon. A folder of notes and maybe 5 minutes of my time. I'd been to that house probably 100 times. More than that, honestly. Since Marcus and I became close in sophomore year, his place had basically become a second home. I knew which step on the staircase creaked, I knew where his mom kept the spare key, I knew the smell of the hallway and the sound the front gate made when you pushed it wrong. It was familiar in the way that only a few places in your life ever get to be. Comfortable. Safe. Unremarkable. I knocked and waited. I was already thinking about what I'd do after, whether I'd go home and eat first or finish the assignment I'd been putting off since Tuesday. My mind was elsewhere entirely. That's the part that gets me when I think back on it. How completely ordinary I was in that moment. How little I was prepared. The door opened and it wasn't Marcus. It was Diana. I'd seen her plenty of times before. Of course I had. She was Marcus's mom, she'd fed me dinner, she'd asked me about school, she'd laughed at things I said from across the kitchen counter. I knew her face. I knew her voice. But standing in the doorway that afternoon, she looked different in a way I couldn't immediately explain and didn't immediately trust myself to examine. She was wearing a dress. Not unusual. But this one fit her differently than anything I could remember, close through the waist, the kind of fabric that moved when she did. Her hair was down. She looked like a woman who hadn't been expecting company but also hadn't been trying to hide anything about herself today. She smiled when she saw me. Warm, easy, the same smile she'd always had. "Hey," she said. "Marcus isn't here. He went out with his cousin about an hour ago." I held up the folder. "He forgot these. I was just going to drop them off." "Of course." She stepped back and held the door wider. "Come in for a second. I'll text him you came by." I stepped inside. The house had that late afternoon feeling, the kind where the light comes in low and golden and everything is slightly warmer than it should be. I followed her down the short hallway into the kitchen, the way I always did, my sneakers quiet on the floor. She moved ahead of me with the kind of ease that women like her have, unhurried, like they've made peace with the space they occupy. There was something baking, or recently baked. Something warm and faintly sweet still hanging in the air. She reached up to the cabinet for a glass and asked if I wanted water. I said yes without thinking about it. I set the folder on the counter and leaned back against it, the edge pressing lightly into my lower back. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the tap, the clink of the glass. I pulled out my phone, half out of habit, but I didn't actually look at it. I was looking at her without meaning to. The way she moved through that space, the tilt of her shoulder as she turned off the tap, the way the fabric of her dress shifted as she crossed toward me, it registered somewhere below conscious thought. Not as anything I would have named out loud. Just a frequency I'd never noticed before, suddenly audible. She set the glass down in front of me. She didn't step back. The counter was behind me. She was close enough that I could smell her, something warm, faintly floral, with an undertone that wasn't perfume exactly, just her, and the kitchen, which had always felt like the most ordinary room in a familiar house, felt suddenly, inexplicably, like somewhere I had never actually been before. I picked up the glass. I took a sip. She looked at me like she was about to say something. And then she didn't. She didn't say whatever it was she'd been about to say. Instead she turned, picked up her glass of wine from the other end of the counter, I hadn't even noticed it sitting there, and took a slow sip. The kind of sip that isn't about thirst. The kind that's about buying a moment. She set it back down and looked at me with something that had rearranged itself into a smile, easy and unhurried, like nothing had shifted at all. Maybe nothing had. Maybe I was constructing things out of ordinary silence. "So how's school been?" she said. Not quite a question. The way some people talk when they're not really starting a conversation about school. "It's fine," I said. "Busy. You know how it gets near the end of the semester." "I remember." She leaned back against the opposite counter and crossed one ankle over the other, the stem of her wine glass held loosely between two fingers. "Everything piling up at once and somehow you're supposed to act like that's a system that makes sense." I laughed a little. "Yeah. Exactly like that." She smiled, a real one this time, not performed. And then she asked me something I wasn't expecting. She asked what I actually wanted to do. Not with school specifically. With my life. With the years that were coming at me whether I was ready or not. She asked it the way someone asks when they already suspect the answer you give most people isn't the real one. I opened my mouth to say the usual thing, the career I'd been telling everyone, the plan that sounded responsible and reasonable, and then something about the way she was looking at me made me stop. "I don't know yet," I said instead. "Honestly." She nodded like that was the more interesting answer. "Good," she said. "The ones who are too sure at your age usually just borrowed someone else's certainty." I looked at her. "That's a very specific thing to say." "I've had time to notice things." She said it lightly but there was weight underneath it, the particular weight of a woman who has watched a version of her own life take shape without her full participation and knows exactly how that happened. I didn't push on it. But I felt it. She asked about Marcus, how I thought he was really doing, not the surface version. I told her the truth, more than I probably would have told most people, and she listened the way that made you want to keep going. Not nodding constantly, not filling every pause. Just present. Her eyes on me. The wine glass moving to her lips occasionally and then back down. The kitchen stayed quiet around us. At some point, I couldn't have said exactly when, she had moved away from the opposite counter. Not dramatically. Just the way a conversation will naturally close the distance between two people as it deepens, without either of them deciding to do it. She was closer to my side of the kitchen now. Still a comfortable distance. Still entirely plausible. She reached past me for something on the counter beside me, a pen, a piece of paper, I couldn't even tell afterward, and her forearm crossed in front of my chest and her shoulder passed close enough to mine that I felt the warmth before I registered the nearness. She was unhurried about it. She took whatever she reached for and straightened back up. Her arm had grazed mine on the way. Just barely. Just enough. She didn't acknowledge it. She set whatever it was back down and continued what she was saying like that inch of contact hadn't just sent something straight up my spine. I kept my face neutral. Or tried to. I took another sip of water and held the glass a little tighter than necessary. She drifted slightly closer again, the way the tide does, not a wave, just a slow and inevitable rise of the water level. She was talking about something, some observation about the neighborhood or the season, and I was answering, and the conversation was entirely normal on its surface. But her hip was now a foot from mine. And she was not looking away from my face. And every time she paused between sentences the silence had a texture to it, warm, aware, patient, like she was in absolutely no hurry to be anywhere else in the world and had made a private decision about how this afternoon was going to end. I didn't move toward her. But I didn't move away. I just stood there in that warm, quiet kitchen, her smell in the air around me, her eyes finding mine each time she finished a thought, and felt something that I had been calling nothing for the last 20 minutes begin, very slowly, to announce itself as something else entirely. She looked at me once more, just briefly, just a flicker of something open and unguarded crossing her face, and then her eyes dropped, for less than a second, to my mouth. She looked back up immediately. Said something ordinary. Sipped her wine. But the room had already changed. And we both knew it. She set her wine glass down. Not to the side, not behind her, she set it down directly on the counter next to me, which meant she had to reach across the space between us, which meant she was close before she was close, her arm crossing the last neutral territory between us like a quiet declaration. She straightened up and she was right there. Not close enough to touch yet. But the kind of close where you can feel the warmth of another person before contact, where the air between two bodies becomes its own presence. She looked at me. Not the way she'd been looking at me for the past 20 minutes, that careful, measuring look with the small smile behind it. This was different. This was direct and unhurried and stripped of the conversational cover we'd both been using. Her eyes moved across my face like she was reading something she'd been trying to make out from a distance for a long time and had finally gotten close enough to see clearly. I didn't say anything. I don't think I could have. She said my name. Just that. One word, low and quiet, the way you say something you've been holding in your mouth for longer than you meant to. Not a question. Not a greeting. Just my name, spoken like she was confirming something to herself. And then her hands came up to my shoulders. Her palms were warm, I felt them through my shirt immediately, that specific human warmth that no amount of anticipation actually prepares you for, and she pressed. Not hard. But with intention. With the kind of pressure that communicates direction, and the direction was back, and my shoulders met the cabinet behind me and the counter edge found the small of my back and I was against it fully, nowhere left to go, and she was in front of me. She moved into the space she'd created. Her body came against mine slowly, chest first, the soft weight of her pressing to my sternum, and I felt her breathe, felt the rise and fall of it against me, and then her hips arrived and that was something else entirely. There was no pretending to misread it. She rolled into me once, slowly, deliberately, the full width of her hips, and the sound she made was barely audible, low, involuntary, breaking loose from somewhere deep in her chest before she could decide whether to let it out. Her dress had risen. I don't know exactly when. Somewhere in the movement, the fabric had shifted and ridden up and now where her thighs met mine there was warmth without barrier, just her skin and the thin cotton of my jeans between us, and the detail of it hit me like a physical impact. My hands had gone to the counter edge behind me. Both of them gripping it. Not pushing her away. Just holding something solid while the room tilted. She moved again. Slower this time. Her hips finding a rhythm that was unhurried and completely certain, like a woman not performing desire but answering it, like a body finally doing what it had been privately rehearsing for months. Each motion rolling through her from the waist down and up through her spine and I felt every part of it through the contact between us. Her hands had loosened on my shoulders. One of them slid slightly, fingers curling into the fabric of my shirt. The other moved up toward my neck, not gripping, just resting, her thumb at the edge of my jaw, a touch so light it was almost worse than pressure. Her hair fell forward. Some of it crossed my face, soft, warm, smelling like vanilla and something warmer underneath it, something that was just her, and she didn't push it back. She let it fall. Her forehead dipped slightly toward my shoulder and another sound came out of her, fuller this time, shaking through her chest and into mine like a frequency, like something that had been compressed for a very long time finally finding a release point. I could feel that she meant it. That was the thing that undid me, not the closeness, not the heat, not even the way her body moved against mine. It was the realness of it. There was nothing calculated in the sounds she was making. Nothing performed. This was a woman who had been holding something in place through sheer discipline for longer than I could probably understand, and whatever architecture had kept it contained had finally come down. My hands left the counter. They found her waist. Not aggressively. Not with the urgency that was building in my chest. Carefully, like I was acknowledging something, like touch was the only honest language available in that moment. My palms settled against the sides of her waist and I felt her react immediately, a small sharp breath, a tightening of the hand at my jaw. I pulled her slightly closer. And her hips rolled with a force that surprised me, deep and deliberate, her whole body behind it, and she whispered my name again into the side of my neck, and this time it didn't sound like confirmation. It sounded like relief. My hands knew what they were doing before I did. That's the only way I can explain it. Some part of me that had been standing politely to the side, respectful, contained, reminding itself of every reason to stay still, simply stopped supervising. And what was left underneath all that restraint was something far more honest. I shifted my grip from her waist and got my hands underneath her, palms against the backs of her thighs, just below where her dress had gathered, and I lifted her. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just enough that her weight redistributed against me, her hips settling higher, her body realigning against mine in a way that changed everything about the contact between us. She gasped. Not loud. Short and sharp and completely genuine, punched out of her by the suddenness of it, and then immediately swallowed back like she hadn't meant to let it out. Her arms came around my neck, both of them now, and her fingers found the back of my head and she held on. Her hips responded before the rest of her caught up. That was what got me. The immediacy of it, the way her body answered the lift without hesitation, without thought, rolling forward and down against me with a force that was nothing like the slow, careful rhythm from before. This was different. This was a woman whose body had been waiting for permission it wasn't going to ask for out loud, and the moment I gave it something real to respond to, everything she'd been moderating came through at once. The sounds she made now were lower. Continuous. Not loud, this wasn't that kind of sound, but unbroken, shaking through her chest in a steady low current, each movement pulling another one loose before the last one finished. I felt them against my throat where her face was pressed. Felt them in my collarbone. Felt them in my hands where I was holding her. I pressed her back slightly against the counter, reversing it, my weight forward now, her between me and the cabinet, and she arched. Her back curved and her head tilted, and for a moment her throat was exposed and I could see her pulse. Rapid. Visible. Real in a way that made something tighten hard in my chest. Her hand moved from the back of my head to my jaw. She did it deliberately, fingers spreading across my face, thumb at the corner of my mouth, and she turned my head toward hers. Not kissing me yet. Just redirecting me. Making me look at her. Our faces were close enough that her breath hit my lips when she exhaled, warm and slightly unsteady, and her eyes were open and dark and completely focused on mine. There was no performance in her face. That was the thing about Diana, there never had been, not since the moment this started. Other people perform desire. They shape it for consumption, make it legible, make it flattering. She wasn't doing any of that. What was in her face was rawer than that. Something that had been in her for a long time, private and unshared, that had finally found an exit point and was coming through without apology. I held her gaze. She rolled her hips again, slower now, deeper, with more deliberate weight, and kept her eyes on mine while she did it, and I understood that this was intentional. She wanted me present. She wanted me here, in this, with her, not just my body responding on instinct but me, specifically, watching her, receiving her. My hand moved up her back. Slowly. Flat-palmed, tracing the line of her spine through the fabric of her dress, learning the shape of her, the dip at the small of her back, the breadth of her shoulders, the warmth coming through the cloth everywhere I touched. She closed her eyes for just a moment when my hand reached the middle of her back, like the contact there hit something she hadn't anticipated, and a breath left her that was longer and less controlled than the ones before it. She opened her eyes again. Found mine again. And what passed between us in that moment wasn't friction or heat or the physical fact of two bodies pressed together in a quiet kitchen on an ordinary afternoon. It was recognition. The specific, irreversible recognition of two people who have crossed from one thing into another and both know, fully, clearly, without the comfort of ambiguity, that there is no walking back to the side of the line they started on. She said my name. Not a whisper this time. Not the low, shaking exhale from before. She said it at full voice, soft but clear, with her forehead dropping against mine and her breath coming in short pulls and her hands holding my face like she needed the anchor. And whatever I had been before I walked through that door, Marcus's friend, the kid with the notes, the young man who always knew his place in this house, he was gone. Something else had taken his place. Something that pulled her closer and held her there, and meant it completely. She kissed me. Or I kissed her. Honestly, I couldn't tell you which one of us closed the last distance, because by that point the distance had become so small, so charged, so unbearable in its precision that the kiss felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability, like something that had been building pressure behind a wall for long enough that the wall simply stopped being a relevant structure. Her mouth was soft. That was the first thing I registered, not heat, not urgency, just softness. The kind that surprises you because you've been bracing for impact and instead you get something that asks you to slow down, to actually be there, to stop anticipating and start feeling. Her lips moved against mine slowly, learning the shape of it, and I felt her exhale through her nose, long and quiet, like she'd been holding that breath since before I arrived. My hand was still at the back of her neck. I felt her pulse there. Still quick. But evening out now, the frantic edge of it softening into something steadier as the kiss deepened and the urgency of the last few minutes gave way to something with more patience in it. She kissed the way she did everything, unhurried, deliberate, fully present. Like she'd decided this was where she was and she wasn't somewhere else in her head. Her fingers were in my hair. Not gripping. Just there, threaded loosely, her palm curved against the back of my skull, warm and still. Like she wanted the contact without the control. Like holding on without holding down. When we finally pulled apart it was slow. Reluctant on both sides in a way that wasn't dramatic, just honest. Her forehead came to rest against mine and she stayed there, eyes closed, one hand still at the side of my face. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The kitchen was completely quiet. Afternoon light had shifted lower through the window, turning the room a deeper amber, and somewhere outside there was the distant sound of a car and then nothing. She laughed. Softly, barely a sound, more an exhale with a smile in it, and it broke the silence in the best possible way. Not embarrassed. Not deflecting. It was the laugh of someone who has just put down something heavy they've been carrying for a long time and feels the specific lightness that follows. Relief dressed as amusement. I pulled back enough to look at her. Her lipstick had blurred slightly at the edges. Her hair was loose around her face. She looked different than she had an hour ago, not undone exactly, but opened. Like a room where someone has finally pushed up the window. "Is this real?" I said. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't scared. It was a genuine question, the kind you ask not because you doubt what happened but because you need to hear it confirmed in language, need the other person to meet you in the reality of it rather than leaving you alone there. She opened her eyes and looked at me steadily. "I've been asking myself that for months," she said. The honesty of it landed quietly. Months. Not today, not this week, not since some recent shift. Months, which meant this had been living inside her through ordinary dinners and casual conversations and all the times I'd been in this house treating it like it was nothing, and she had been carrying it carefully and privately and alone. I didn't know what to do with that entirely. But I didn't look away from it. She straightened slightly, her hands dropping from my face and settling against my chest, not pushing, just resting, like she needed to feel that I was still there and solid. She looked down at them for a moment and then back up at me. "I know what you're thinking about," she said. I didn't answer. "Marcus," she said. Just the name. Flat and clear and unafraid of it. The name sat between us like an object we both had to acknowledge before we could figure out where to put it. I felt the weight of it. The friendship, years of it, easy and real, and what it meant that I was standing in his kitchen with his mother's hands on my chest and her lipstick on my mouth. She watched me feel it. She didn't try to dissolve it or argue it away. She just gave me space to hold it and waited. "I'm not asking you to choose anything right now," she said finally. "I'm not asking you for anything. She paused. Her jaw tightened slightly, the way it does when someone is deciding how honest to be. "I needed you to know that this wasn't nothing. For me. Whatever you do with that." I looked at her for a long time. The loneliness she'd referenced earlier in the conversation had taken on a shape now. I could see it more clearly, the years of managing this house and this life with a kind of graceful competence that looked like contentment from the outside and probably wasn't always. I thought about the way she'd asked me what I actually wanted, earlier, like it was a question she wished someone had asked her more often. I thought about the way she'd listened. The way she'd looked at me before any of this started, that first long moment at the door when something had already been decided in her that she hadn't yet acted on. I reached out and took her hand. She looked down at it. Then up at me. I didn't have a speech. I didn't have a plan or a promise or a clean answer to any of the complicated things that live just outside this kitchen. But I had that, her hand in mine, held deliberately, held like it mattered. And in that moment it was the only true thing I knew how to offer. She looked at our hands and then back at my face, and something in her expression settled. Not resolved, there was still too much undecided for resolution. But settled, the way a person looks when they've been given enough to stand on for right now. That was enough. For right now, it was enough. I drove home with the windows down. Not because it was hot. Because I needed the air, needed something moving against my face, something immediate and physical that wasn't memory, wasn't the smell of her kitchen or the warmth of her hands or the specific softness of her mouth that my own mouth was still trying to process. The wind helped. A little. Not enough. I got home and sat in the parked car for longer than I should have. The engine off, the street quiet, the evening doing its ordinary thing around me while I sat completely still and tried to locate something stable inside myself to stand on. I couldn't find it. I went inside. I ate something, I couldn't tell you what. I sat at my desk and opened the assignment I'd been ignoring for 3 days and stared at it without reading a single word. My mind kept returning to the kitchen. Not in pieces, not in flashes, in full, complete, sensory detail. The counter at my back. Her weight against me. The way her voice sounded when she said my name like it was the only word in a language she'd been keeping private. I shut the laptop. I lay down on my bed and looked at the ceiling and let myself think about Marcus. That was the part I'd been avoiding. The part I'd been keeping behind a door in my chest all afternoon, not because I'd forgotten it but because opening it while she was still in front of me had felt like a choice I wasn't ready to make in real time. Now I had no reason not to open it. Marcus was my closest friend. Had been since we were 16, thrown together by a seating chart and kept together by everything that followed, the late nights, the stupid arguments, the real ones, the years of accumulated shorthand that made up a friendship that actually meant something. He trusted me in the uncomplicated way that people trust friends they've never had reason to doubt. Completely. Without fine print. I thought about his face. The easy way he laughed. The way he'd texted me this afternoon asking if I'd been able to drop the notes off. I'd replied yes and nothing else and he'd sent back a thumbs up and that was the extent of it, this small ordinary exchange sitting on top of everything that had actually happened in his kitchen, and the gap between those two things was enormous and I felt it in my sternum like a bruise. I didn't sleep. I lay there for hours in the specific exhaustion of a person whose body is tired and whose mind refuses to cooperate, turning the afternoon over and examining it from every angle. I tried to be honest with myself, not generous, not self-serving, just honest. And the honest answer was that what happened hadn't felt like a mistake while it was happening. It had felt like the opposite of a mistake. It had felt like the first fully true thing I'd experienced in longer than I could account for. That didn't make it simple. I thought about her. About the laugh she'd let out when it was over, that exhale of relief dressed as amusement. About the loneliness I'd heard under her words when she talked about the last few years. About the way she'd said I'm not asking you for anything with the particular dignity of a woman who has learned how to need things quietly. I thought about how she'd looked when I took her hand, the way her expression had settled, like she'd been bracing for something harder and found something gentler instead. I thought about what she must be feeling right now in that same house, alone. My phone was face down on the mattress beside me. I hadn't touched it. I was afraid of what I would do if I picked it up, afraid I'd say too much or not enough, afraid the wrong message would make something fragile collapse before it had a chance to become sturdy. I left it alone. Somewhere around 2 in the morning the ceiling stopped offering answers and I accepted that it wasn't going to. I rolled onto my side and closed my eyes and did the thing where you don't sleep but you rest, where your body goes horizontal and still even though your mind keeps moving at its own slow persistent pace. And then my phone lit up. I felt the light through my eyelids before I heard the sound. I reached for it without deciding to. One notification. A message. From her. I stared at the screen for a moment before I opened it, the way you pause before opening something you know is going to matter. 3 sentences. I don't regret it. I just don't want you to. That's all. I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone down on my chest and looked at the ceiling again, but it was different now. The room was the same, the dark was the same, the unresolved weight of everything was largely the same. But something had shifted in it, some specific pressure had released, like a knot that hadn't loosened but had been confirmed as real, had been acknowledged by both sides, which is its own kind of relief. She wasn't performing. She wasn't managing me or shaping my response or asking for something wrapped in the language of asking for nothing. She was just telling me the truth in the fewest possible words and leaving the rest to me. I picked up the phone. I typed something. Deleted it. The first version was too much, too earnest, too searching, too many words trying to do what a simpler thing could do better. I typed it again. Shorter. Truer. I don't. 2 words. I stared at them for a long time, longer than it takes to read 2 words, longer than it takes to decide whether they're true, because I'd already decided that. I was staring at them because sending them was a different action than feeling them, and I wanted to be sure I understood the difference before I crossed it. I sent it. The message showed delivered. Then read. Then nothing, no reply, no typing indicator, just the quiet of the screen. But somehow that was right. She'd said what she needed to say. I'd said what I needed to say. The rest of it, the enormity of what came next, the conversation about Marcus that would eventually have to happen, the question of what this actually was and where it could actually go, all of that still existed, unchanged, waiting. But it was waiting on the other side of something honest. And for the first time since I'd walked out of that kitchen, I closed my eyes and actually slept. I went back the next evening. Not because I had a plan. Not because I'd worked out the answers to any of the questions that had kept me awake the night before, I hadn't. The conversation about Marcus still existed. The complications still existed. The gap between what this was and what the world outside it would make of it still existed, wide and real and not going anywhere simply because I wanted it to. I went back because not going felt like a lie. I'd spent enough of the previous night being honest with myself that I knew the difference now between caution and avoidance, and staying away would have been avoidance dressed in reasonable clothing. So I drove over in the early evening when the light was low and amber and the neighborhood was quiet, and I sat outside for a minute the way I had in my own driveway the night before, and then I got out of the car and walked up to the door and knocked. She opened it almost immediately. Like she'd heard the car. Or like she'd been somewhere near the front of the house, not waiting exactly, but not far. She was in different clothes than yesterday, simpler, softer, a loose shirt and dark trousers, her hair pulled back loosely with pieces falling around her face. She looked like herself. Not the version of herself that had been standing in the kitchen doorway yesterday with something barely contained behind her eyes. Just herself, quieter, the morning after. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. I looked back. There was a question in the air between us, not hostile, not afraid, just large. The question of what I was here to say. What I'd decided. Whether I'd come to carefully and kindly put distance between us or whether I'd come for something else. I said, I want to figure it out. With you. Not by myself. She held my gaze while I said it and kept holding it after, like she was checking the weight of it, making sure it was load-bearing before she trusted it. I'm not looking for something easy, she said. I know. I mean that. I'm not interested in something that disappears when it gets complicated. She said it evenly, without accusation, but with the particular directness of a woman who has learned the cost of hoping for things people weren't actually prepared to give. I've done that. I'm not doing it again. I'm not offering easy, I said. I'm offering honest. That's the only kind I know how to do. Something moved across her face. Not a smile yet, something that came before a smile, the internal thing that decides whether a smile is warranted. She stepped back and let me in. We ended up in the kitchen again. Of course we did. It was the room where everything had happened, where the air still felt slightly altered, where the counter and the cabinet and the particular afternoon light had all become charged objects in the private geography of what we were to each other now. She put the kettle on. I leaned against the counter, not the same one as yesterday, a different one, enough distance from the sight of things that we could talk without the memory of them being too loud. We talked for a long time. About Marcus, she brought him up herself, directly, without flinching. She said she wasn't going to pretend that wasn't complicated because it was, and she wasn't going to ask me to manage it in any particular way because that was mine to figure out and she respected that. She said she didn't know what the right answer was. She just knew that pretending yesterday hadn't happened wasn't available to her anymore as an option. It had been available before, she'd been using it for months, keeping what she felt filed under something she could ignore, and now it wasn't. I told her I'd figure out Marcus. Not today, not with a script, not by lying or by performing a version of myself that hadn't been in that kitchen with her. But I'd figure it out. Because he deserved honesty and so did she and so did I, and building something real on a foundation of managed silence wasn't something I was willing to do. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. But the way she said it carried everything, acceptance and relief and the particular exhale of a person who has been waiting to find out if they're going to be met where they are and has just gotten their answer. The kettle finished. She made 2 cups and we moved from the kitchen to the living room and sat together on the couch with the lamps on and the evening settling dark and quiet outside the window. We kept talking, easier now, lighter, the way a conversation gets after the hard part has been said and survived. She told me things about herself I hadn't known. I told her things I hadn't planned to. The hours went the way they do when you're somewhere you actually want to be with someone who actually interests you, not quickly, not slowly, just honestly, without the constant awareness of time that marks conversations you're only half present for. At some point the talking slowed. Not because we'd run out of things to say but because words weren't what the moment needed anymore. She had shifted slightly toward me somewhere in the last hour and I had shifted toward her and now she was close, the way she'd been close yesterday but entirely differently, no urgency, no contained wanting finally breaking through its container. Just nearness. Chosen and quiet and mutual. I put my arm around her from behind. She leaned back into it, her back against my chest, her head tilting slightly toward my shoulder, her hands coming to rest over mine where they crossed at her waist. I felt her exhale. Long and slow and complete, the kind of exhale that comes from somewhere deeper than the lungs. Outside, a car passed. The lamp made warm shapes on the wall. Her fingers laced through mine and held on, unhurried, with the specific ease of something that has stopped pretending to be less than it is. I pressed my face briefly into her hair. She turned her head slightly, not pulling away, just adjusting, and her cheek rested against the side of my face and we stayed like that, quiet, warm, the weight of everything we'd just said still present but no longer heavy, converted now into something that felt less like a burden and more like a foundation. I thought about what I'd been when I walked through that door yesterday afternoon. The notes in my hand, my mind elsewhere, my whole understanding of this house and everyone in it fixed and certain and entirely wrong. And I thought about what I was now. I didn't have a clean word for it yet. We hadn't used any of the words, not the defining ones, not the ones that make something official and visible to the world outside. Maybe that conversation came later. Maybe it came soon. But it didn't feel necessary tonight because tonight something more fundamental than language had already been established. We had chosen each other. Quietly, honestly, with full awareness of the cost. That was enough to build on. I was beginning to understand, how everything real begins.